As America engages in trade battles, the world watches a potential shift in the global economic landscape. Are we on the cusp of a new era where China's rising star eclipses the influence of the United States? The Trump administration, seeking to pressure Beijing, imposed 20% tariffs on Chinese goods. However, instead of succumbing to pressure, China is finding new avenues, strengthening trade ties with countries like Canada and the European Union. Instead of yielding to pressure, China demonstrates resolve and is the first to retaliate against American tariffs, fundamentally changing the game for American businesses. Farmers, industrial enterprises, and energy suppliers in the U.S. are under attack, losing access to the Chinese market, which was a key source of demand for them. Prices for their products are plummeting, uncertainty shrouds prospects, and competitors from other countries are wasting no time in seizing the vacated niche. It seems that Washington is creating difficulties for itself. American business and the Chinese economy are inextricably linked, which often escapes the attention of the general public. Companies from the U.S. depend on China not only as a platform for low-cost production, but also as a huge consumer market. Escalating the tariff war threatens rising prices, job losses, and a struggle for survival for entire enterprises. The technology industry is particularly vulnerable. Giants such as Apple, Intel, and Qualcomm are heavily dependent on the Chinese market, where a significant portion of their income is generated. Apple, for example, manufactures most of its iPhones in China and sells about 16% of its products there. However, the company is already facing an outflow of customers, which indicates the seriousness of the consequences of the trade conflict. In today's world, the global economy is permeated with complex interconnections, where dependence on one market can be decisive for entire industries. Qualcomm, one of the leaders in the production of chips for smartphones, receives a significant portion of its profits, almost half, from the Chinese market. This indicates that China for many corporations is not just a production site, but also a key consumer, determining their financial well-being. Losing access to this huge and dynamically developing market can seriously damage business. And this applies not only to technology companies. The automotive industry is also closely linked to China. General Motors, for example, sells significantly more cars in China than in the U.S., about 3.8 million per year. Now the company is facing financial difficulties, and other automakers are in a similar situation. In the event of new tariffs, these companies could suffer significant losses, leading not only to rising prices, but also to loss of customers and billions of dollars in sales. Even well-known brands like Nike and Starbucks are building their development strategy, focusing on the Chinese market. Nike, for example, earned about $7 billion in China in 1 year, and abandoning such profits would be extremely undesirable for the company. It was initially assumed that the introduction of tariffs would weaken the Chinese economy, but in practice they also have a negative impact on American companies. When the U.S. imposes taxes on Chinese goods, companies have two options: either reduce their profits to cover additional costs, or pass them on to consumers by raising prices on goods. In any case, this can lead to negative consequences for American business and consumers. The news does not bode well. Rising prices for steel and aluminum will inevitably affect the budget of construction companies and the automotive industry. Ultimately, this will lead to an increase in the cost of the most ordinary things, from kitchen coffee makers and trash cans to favorite carbonated drinks and beer poured into aluminum cans. Some hope that the introduction of tariffs will become an incentive for the return of production to the United States. However, as practice shows, the situation is much more complicated. Labor costs in America are significantly higher than in China, which makes American goods less competitive in price. Even when individual American toy factories noted an increase in the number of orders due to the introduction of tariffs, the increased production costs were immediately passed on to consumers. In addition to the high cost of labor, the United States faces the problem of a lack of necessary infrastructure for large-scale production. Many industries were transferred abroad decades ago, and it will take years and huge investments to restore supply chains. A prime example is the garment industry, where even taking into account the tariffs introduced, production in China remains more profitable than in the U.S. A similar situation is observed in the aerospace sector, which is critically dependent on specialized parts manufactured predominantly abroad. Returning production capacity to the homeland is a task fraught with enormous difficulties and requiring significant financial investment. Corporations have built their businesses in China for many years, and abandoning established relationships is a daunting task. Relocation is a lengthy, costly, and sometimes completely impossible process. As a result, businesses will face rising costs, consumers will face rising prices, and workers will face the risk of job losses if companies fail to adapt to the new conditions. Strengthening American industry requires carefully crafted strategies, not just tariff barriers that could harm the entire economic system. The Trump administration's aggressive approach to forcing economic concessions from Beijing is leading to a much more complex scenario. China, not accustomed to yielding to pressure, is quickly retaliating by sharply reducing imports of American products and strengthening trade ties with other countries, primarily Canada and the European Union. This strategic maneuver entails a reshaping of international trade alliances, putting the United States in a vulnerable position. The consequences for American industry are not only palpable but also manifest immediately. Consider, for example, the agricultural sector of the U.S. economy. Farmers, accustomed to stable demand from China, are now facing the reality of shrinking orders. This situation leads to market saturation, falling purchase prices, and, as a result, reduced profitability of farms. Similar processes are observed in American industry. The Chinese government is reducing purchases of machine tools and high-tech equipment manufactured in the United States, which painfully affects exporters. Energy suppliers are also feeling the effects of the changed environment. China is reducing its imports of American oil and gas, which entails a whole series of negative effects. Instability is growing, price fluctuations are increasing, and American companies are incurring billions in losses. While the United States is losing ground, competitors are actively exploiting the situation to their advantage. Other countries are increasing trade with China, occupying the vacated niches. This shift not only undermines the economic position of American businesses but also weakens the influence of the United States in global markets. Paradoxically, a strategy designed to strengthen leading positions is leading to America gradually losing its presence in key areas of international trade. On the domestic economic front in the United States, the picture is not much brighter. Retail chains, such as Walmart, have found themselves between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they are forced to somehow compensate for the increased costs associated with the introduction of new customs tariffs. On the other hand, they cannot afford to sharply raise prices, fearing to scare away customers for whom every penny counts. According to some reports, Walmart's management is putting strong pressure on its Chinese suppliers, demanding that they lower their selling prices. The calculation is simple. The burden of the new tariffs should fall on the shoulders of producers, not consumers. However, these actions have not gone unnoticed in Beijing. Chinese authorities summoned representatives of the American retail chain to express their dissatisfaction. This episode serves as a vivid illustration of the growing tension in relations between multinational corporations and the governments of various countries. The Chinese leadership skillfully uses the disagreements between the United States and its traditional allies in Europe. Chinese diplomats have stepped up their activities in the European direction, seeking to strengthen relations with the countries of the European Union, whose leaders are increasingly tired of Washington's assertive policies. Offering itself as a reliable and predictable partner ready for mutually beneficial cooperation, China seeks to expand economic ties with Europe, which may run counter to the interests of the United States. America has embarked on a path fraught with unpredictable consequences. A trade war, conceived as an instrument to weaken China, has turned into a strengthening of its international position. While economic analysts are closely monitoring the state of the American economy, where the first signs of trouble are beginning to appear, trade battles are unfolding against the backdrop of a complex dilemma facing the Federal Reserve System. How to keep inflation under control and at the same time prevent a recession triggered by the trade war. However, perhaps the most significant event was the rapprochement between China and Canada, striving to conclude new energy agreements. The escalation of the trade war has triggered tectonic shifts in the global energy landscape, reshaping alliances and trade routes. The United States, historically a key supplier of oil and liquefied natural gas, LNG, to China, has faced the disruption of previous ties due to imposed trade restrictions. In search of alternative solutions, both countries have turned their attention to new partners. The situation is exacerbated by Washington's decision to impose 10% tariffs on Canadian oil imports, an attempt to pressure Canada to revise trade agreements. Instead of the expected capitulation, Ottawa made an unexpected strategic maneuver towards Beijing, marking a tectonic shift in the global energy landscape. A key element of the Canadian strategy was a large-scale modernization of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which significantly increased the country's export capabilities. Thanks to this modernization, Canada has been able to send huge volumes of oil directly to China, bypassing traditional American markets. The significant increase in pipeline capacity not only opened wide doors to Asian markets for Canada, but also significantly reduced its dependence on U.S. refineries. This marked a turning point in North American energy dynamics. In parallel, China's insatiable demand for liquefied natural gas, LNG, has turned Beijing's attention to the Canadian LNG Canada project. This large-scale natural gas export terminal, located in British Columbia, is scheduled to begin operations in 2025. The project, with its initial capacity of 14 million tons per year, symbolizes a monumental step in transforming Canada into a key player in the global LNG market. In an effort to secure its energy arteries, China is showing increasing interest in Canadian liquefied natural gas, which is part of a strategy to reduce dependence on American supplies. Canadian energy companies, in turn, are actively building bridges with Asian markets, seeking to expand the horizons of their exports. An example of this is the deal between ARC Resources and ExxonMobil's Asia-Pacific division, which provides for the annual supply of 1.5 million tons of LNG. This agreement not only strengthens Canada's position as an LNG exporter, but also meets China's desire for stable and diverse energy sources. Against the backdrop of trade disputes with the United States, Canada is considering retaliatory steps that could add additional tension to energy relations between the countries. In particular, measures are being discussed to limit oil exports to the United States or to introduce export duties, which could deal a tangible blow to American refineries that depend on Canadian oil. These steps are a signal of growing tensions and a potential restructuring of energy partnerships. Overall, these events reflect a global trend. China is actively strengthening its energy security, seeking to hedge against the risks associated with geopolitical instability. Seeking to secure its energy horizons, China is diversifying its sources of resources and strengthening ties with countries like Canada. This strategic maneuver not only protects its own interests, but also undermines the dominant position of the United States in the global energy arena. Such an energy reshuffle calls into question the future of global energy alliances and could have serious economic consequences for states whose prosperity depends on the current balance of power. The change in China's trade priorities has painfully affected the U.S. agricultural sector, putting it on the brink of disaster. The protracted trade war has hit producers of soybeans, wheat, corn, and pork particularly hard. Once one of the largest consumers of American agricultural products, China provided 40% of its soybean imports from the United States in 2016. By 2023, this share had decreased to 18%, while Brazil and Argentina now meet 74% of China's soybean needs. This sharp turn of events has forced American farmers to face overproduction and falling prices, and the looming reality of mass bankruptcies is becoming increasingly evident. The disaster that has struck rural farms has echoed throughout the complex network of the agro-industrial complex. Processing plants, transportation arteries, and agricultural machinery factories have shuddered under the burden of colossal losses. The situation has become so critical that the U.S. Department of Agriculture has had to direct emergency financial assistance of $12 billion to support affected farmers. Soybean producers, who took the brunt of the disaster, received $8 billion in compensation for losses incurred. However, the problems do not end there. Driven by its demand for pork, China has sharply increased imports from Europe. Supplies from European Union countries have soared by 35%, pushing American exporters out of the market. China's retaliatory tariffs, which have been extended to almost all agricultural products from the United States, have made American goods uncompetitive on the world stage. This strategic maneuver has not only undermined the position of the American agricultural sector, but has also raised serious concerns about further economic consequences. At the same time, China continues to strengthen its economic resilience by reducing its dependence on American imports. By diversifying its sources of supply and strengthening domestic production, the country is not only protecting itself from external shocks but also strengthening its position in international negotiations. It seems that Washington's trade and economic policy needs serious reassessment, otherwise, the United States risks losing its leading position in the global supply system and, as a result, a significant share of its economic influence. Now, when the stakes are higher than ever, Inaction could lead to the decline of the era of American dominance in global trade. However, this chapter of history is not yet finished. Stay tuned to be aware of key events in this ongoing struggle for economic leadership on the world stage. Until next